This is part of our regular workshop series. This is a special one because it's sort of a two-parter. I don't really believe in the broad surveys at the beginning to cold people in order to discover things. And I do believe in surveys as a mechanism at the discovery phase to identify demographically who you want to do the one-on-one interviews for. And so Megan is going to do a second workshop in a month, which is about once you've done the survey and once you've found the kind of person with the kind of problem you care about, to then interview them on a one-on-one and actually create value out of it. So this two-parter is important to do both sides of it, I think. But Megan has been doing this kind of research for a very long time, is connected through Roy into this lean startup conversation. Megan, could you dive in, please?
Yeah, so I run a sole proprietorship research firm called the Insight In. I work with subcontractors if I need a lot of extra stuff, but really, you know, the sort of buck stops and starts with me. So you guys may know what that's like. I started my business about 5 years ago and have been doing that full time ever since. But before that, I had a decade of experience in the advertising world. So I was in advertising strategy, but the kind of agencies that are just, big agencies you've probably heard of and all of the wonderful shows about advertising. That means that you're very much involved in all aspects of the product, right? Not just advertising. You're involved in, the product development and understanding where things are going. If you're really sort of a great strategist, you're involved in all of that. So in some ways, I was kind of a business strategist for 10 years before sort of shifting into research. And the reason I did that was because it can have limited value. Look, I'll be the first to say that research, can have its detractors based on the fact that sometimes it just isn't that helpful. And I understand, having been someone who was looking at research documents for 10 years before I started in research full time, that they can leave a lot to be desired. They can leave a lot on the table. And what I kind of came to is that, great research is really about great research design. And that is something that is often the point at which companies can be laziest, research companies. They can sort of, give you a templated answer of, okay, well, we've had someone else come to us for this kind of thing, so let's just literally pull it up and recycle what we did and change some words, and then that'll be fine for this product or this situation. And that's definitely not the case. I actually worked abroad in Australia at a research firm down there and found that's very much how they started a lot of projects. Go see what we did on this thing that was similar, and we'll go there. So, for me, my passion is really around sort of helping all kinds of brands of all sizes. I originally thought that very much being a business of one, that I would be serving small businesses mostly that couldn't afford big companies. Come to find that I have everybody from startups all the way to Fortune 5s, right? AT&T, DirecTV, LinkedIn, all these folks choose to hire one person to work with them, which must tell me I'm doing something right. The other thing is that, the startup that I started working with in 2020, late 2015, early 2016, just became a unicorn. So Remitly just went through, and especially the financial person probably knows of them in fintech. They just went through their sort of, I can't remember if it was their fourth or fifth round of funding, and they hit unicorn status, right? So when I started working with them, they were basically 25 to 50 people on top of Nordstrom Rack in the old building downtown that you guys may be familiar with on Second Ave. And it was, cords everywhere and a total mess. And, they had yet to do primary audience work and to really find out in a primary research way what their audiences were all about. They had some assumptions based on the products and services they had started to be gravitated toward, but nothing more. So I really came in and did their very first round of consumer research that they had ever done, and continued to work with them here and there over the course of 4 or 5 years when they would get into a new market and open up a new corridor, try to go after a new audience. It was often like, hey, what's the lay of the land in Ghana, let's go find out. And we would sort of talk to some Ghanaian immigrants. So, there's huge opportunity to continue learning, but, I'm very proud of that example because they were very much utilizing me for their very first research they had ever done, and they've been very successful. Hope that gives you guys a sense of who you're talking to. Oh, John,
Yeah,
you
I'm
might be
muted, John.
muted. There you go.
But just so you know, I did post the link on the meetup event page, hoping that a couple more people would come over.
Okay, great, thank you. So Megan, please
Yeah.
continue with the slides and get going.
Yeah, so I'm gonna share my screen here. Forgive the ugly slides, but I chose Homer Simpson as a theme just to try to keep it light. There's no question that, finding your audience via survey, as John said, is not always like the easiest thing in the world. It's a strange research design. Usually with research design, there's something incredibly specific that you're looking for. And when we were talking about this initially, I said, okay, so we're trolling the ocean, right? And that's the hardest kind of research to do in design, like full disclosure. It's much easier when people come and say, hey, I've got these 3 segments that I'm thinking are my segments. So let's do a deep dive among them, right? So that we're recruiting only those people, and then we're talking to those people in a very targeted way, getting a sort of richer output that way. In this case, because it's just a little bit of like, we want to see where here comes everybody, who's really going to, be someone who has that problem, as John said, or appeals, my product, prototype or concept appeals to, that's a slightly different ask. I would be totally remiss, though, if I didn't talk to the very basics of writing surveys, because this is something that can actually make or break your survey. As I talked about with research design, I've actually in startup levels, I've seen a lot of bad surveys that they've conducted and then based a lot of internal assumptions on those, Remitly, but also others. I'm not throwing them under the bus. But I'll see survey questions that are just sort of written erroneously, which means that the data is erroneous, hopefully not completely off the rocker, but I've seen some stuff that has made me think that, wow, they've been, spending 6 months chasing an assumption that's probably coming from bad data and may not have come out that way otherwise. And I'll sort of show you some examples of that. And these are just super basics, so forgive me if we're covering anything that you guys already know. But I think it's nice to take that step back and just remember, when it's your product or service, I know because I also market myself as a single business owner, it's very hard to sort of pull back and to take that more impartial view. So that's some of what we're talking about here with the do's and don'ts, and I have one slide on each. Just a reminder that, you may want to know about this and that, but those have to be separate questions. I see a lot of surveys that say things like, how satisfied are you with your pay and job conditions? That's a very valid question, except that there's no way to know when someone's responding about their satisfaction level if they're responding based on their pay or on their job descriptions, job conditions. So that needs to be separated into 2 questions. So something more to your guys' liking might be something like, hey, is this, new app I'm offering you, or did this app, was it interesting and useful to you? Well, no, it was either interesting or useful, and to what degree, right? So, there's different ways that you can sort of, accidentally be asking something in a way that's going to get you an answer that's pretty fuzzy. You won't know which one they're responding to. So in general with survey writing, you want to watch out for the word "and." It's a killer. It shouldn't necessarily be in any of the questions that you ask. Think about always as you're going, that's not just true of this one, how your audience would answer, right? And almost try to think like your audience very hard. How satisfied am I with my pay? Oh, that's a separate thing than my conditions of my job. And then when in doubt, break it up. Like if you have any doubt at all whatsoever, just break it up. Definitely leading the witness is something I see a lot of times when people are close to it, right? So I think it was Paul made the point about being close to something. It's so much harder to see it. And, a lot of times, I'll have sort of see surveys where people say, what do you love about blank? And their product or service is listed in there. And they see that as a super valid question. I want to know what you love about me. And in doing that, you're sort of leading the witness. They may not love you. We haven't established that yet, right? So something like, do you have any issues with your coworkers, is assuming that I have issues. We haven't established it yet. So there can be a question before that where you establish, you know, if someone has that issue, and then you can ask that. But you don't just want to ask that out of the blue, because, you know, even though we can kind of assume that people have issues with their coworkers, if they haven't indicated as such, you're leading them to say yes, right? People definitely want to answer yes in surveys. It's our inherent bias to sort of go like, oh, well, if you're saying there's issues with coworkers, yes, there is going to be issues with coworkers, whether they're having them or not. So it could lead more people to say they're having issues than actually are. And that would be true for your product and problem solution stuff that you're looking to do. What, you know, how many problems have you had trying to open a can? Well, you know, have we established that I have those problems yet, right? The impartial ask, of course, could be a very open-ended thing of please describe your relationship with your coworkers, where then, you know, we're looking to make sure in our open ends that they've indicated, yes, okay, they do have an issue. And then my next question is like, okay, you know, of the positive things you mentioned, of the issues that you have, blah, blah, blah. Another way of just getting more brass tacks about that, what are some factors that matter when you're thinking about your relationship with your coworkers, and giving them a closed-ended, you know, list of answers. And things like even, you know, pretty innocuous things. We assume prices might change year to year, saying how much do you expect the company to increase prices next year? Again, carries an assumption in it that the prices are going to go up. You know, maybe what, if any, price change you expect then the next year is more impartiality, right? So think about that altitude thing. I think that's a really nice way to think about surveys, especially when you're close to it, is like, what altitude am I looking at this as? If it's, you know, what issues do you have with your coworkers? There's an altitude above that you can reach. Presumptive language is something that, you know, like I said, I think we can all assume people have issues with their coworkers, but if we haven't established that in a survey yet, it's actually not proper form. And it means that, like I said, people might be more inclined to answer yes, whether they intend to or not, just based in their subconscious. And also you do have to watch for, you know, pretty loaded words or strong words. And those might be ones that we use, you know, and you might use with your coworkers or your colleagues in discussions about how to write this survey. You might be like, man, they're having an awful time with this or that. And we want to make sure we know the things that they absolutely hate about this or that. You know, those are really strong words. And again, given that people want to agree and go along, if you say, what do you hate about XYZ? They may not actually hate anything about it, but you're going to get an answer that indicates that they do, because that's the question you've asked them. So watch for that really strong language. You know, another way of saying that would be the more impartial, you know, describe any issues that you've had with XYZ. Allowing an out. I get surveys all the time. I love to sign up for company surveys and get them in my inbox. It's a really good way, if you guys don't do that, you know, to see how other people are writing their surveys, and it helps train your brain on how to pick out mistakes. So I subscribe to US soccer surveys. They send me stuff all the time that says, how many games of US soccer did you watch in the last month? 1 to 3, 4 to 6. 7 to 8, or more than 8. And it's like, well, I could have watched 0, right? So those kinds of outs are really important to have. When you're putting together a scale, oftentimes, again, it's our bias. Well, I'm sending this to my US soccer members, so of course they're watching soccer in this month, but maybe they didn't, right? So you have to sort of, even when you're doing something that's a very assumptive thing, like how many bars are in a 20-mile radius of your house, people may live somewhere where there's just not a bar in their area, which is crazy to us, but might be true. So there are no bars in my area, or something like that has to be there as an option. Especially in demography, you guys are going to do some demographic hits because you really want to make sure you know your audience on the back end. Always have a prefer not to answer. It's just good survey practice, and also it prevents a lot of drop off. A lot of people get really pissed about demographic questions, and they have every right to. You know, giving them an opt out is actually a way to keep them in survey. And, you know, even with male, female, you know, also it's proper to have non-binary at this point. And then, you know, not sure is one that I don't see used very often at all in surveys, especially things like advertising surveys. I would see people say, you know, have you seen the ad that, you know, is for Pringles? Have you seen an ad for Pringles in the last month? Yes or no? It's like, well, I don't really know. Like, I don't remember, right? So not sure is actually a whole valid response. So if you say yes or no and you box me in, you're going to get some really bad data on the back end, because I would imagine that something like 60% plus of people just really aren't sure if they've seen an ad for Pringles in the last month, right? So imagine them being forced to choose yes or no, and then all the bad data you're going to get on the back end of that. So make sure you're checking for every possible scenario in your answer keys. It's okay if they don't use an out, but you provide it, right? Like there's nothing lost for providing it. And then really other please specify is the ultimate out, right? Especially when you're providing a closed list of attributes like, it's warm, it's fuzzy, it's, charming, it's all of these things. If you use an other, please specify, something like less than 5% of people will use it, but you may learn something really important in those. This is one I see all the time. You guys have some products or services that have tangible and intangible benefits, sometimes attributes and benefits. And I always see in early startup stage where they just cram everything into one answer blank, and it drives me nuts because those things aren't necessarily equal, right? If I asked you what the factors are when choosing a restaurant, you're probably not going to put something like the kindness of the staff on the same plane that you would put something like they've got, good food, good quality food, or low prices, right? Things like good food and low prices are some gatekeeper things for restaurants, and also they're tangibles. Things like, having, kind staff is an intangible, right? It's something that doesn't belong in the list. It's a feeling, not a feature, if that makes sense. And so I've often seen clients in early startup stage be like, all people care about is price. All people care about is a discount. We've done a lot of surveys. And I look at their survey list, and yeah, if you ask people if they want a discount, and then you also have like good customer service in the list, they're going to choose the discount, right? So I've had people say, oh, our the one thing we know about our audience is they're extremely price sensitive. Well, you even need to think about whether price needs to play a role in this particular factors of choosing a restaurant right now, because maybe that's not germane. Maybe price is a totally different question, right? Maybe there's something around elasticity of price and what do I usually spend on a meal? That's a much better way to determine whether or not someone is willing to spend what you've got versus jamming it in there with, oh, I love discounts as well as, nice customer service. That's always going to be third or fourth on the list. So just sort of separating in your brain into different buckets based on, in my basic thing, feature and feeling. But for you guys and your specific needs, there could be further separation that you do. You could say, hey, I need to know which of these specific features people like the best, but then I need to know which of these specific benefits that they see as most applicable to them. Oh, I can sleep in an airport and in privacy is a different benefit than, it's made with 100%, merino wool, right? Those don't belong in the same thing. So there may also be very specific needs that you have, like price elasticity, how much would you be willing to pay for that kind of thing, that have to sort of impact how you build these questions. Also, just separate your tangible, or sorry, that's the wrong darn headline. Here, I'll just change it live. No overlap is going to be the thing there. Okay, so basically, I see this all the time in demos, and it will screw up your demos. And I know that for you guys, demos is going to be a really big deal. I see overlap demos all the time. Just make sure that things are completely separated. Less than $25,000 and $25,000 to $50,000. If I make exactly $50,000, I don't belong in one bucket. I belong in two. So just make sure you're scanning for distinction. I see this all the time. Especially where I see it is how often do you use a product or service? And I'll see, one time every 3 months. And then I'll see the next bucket that says, about once a month. And it's like, it actually, in order to be proper, needs to say no more than once in a month, but less than once every 3 months, right? That should be one bucket. So what you have to do is sort of give people those room without overlap, or in that case, without, I've seen surveys all the time that say, I use this product about once a week, about once a month, about once a month, quarter, and about once a year. And I'm like, what about the people that are using it twice a month, or the people that are using it twice a year? where do they go? So the other thing is no overlap, but also make sure that you're including a range in there when you're talking about a specific moment in time, to make sure that people can answer, because I might buy it 2 times a month or 3 times a month, but that option isn't available to me. So really making sure, and that sounds laborious, but really the best survey practice on something like purchase behavior is, I bought this generally about once a month, but no more than 2 times a month or whatever it is. And then open ends, I've often seen surveys that just don't deploy them at all, and I don't know why. Sure, most people are going to buzz through them as fast as humanly possible. We know that. About 2/3 of your open ends are going to be junk. But that 1/3 you can learn a lot from. The places where you need to deploy them are really where the why could be multifaceted. Why did I say that? And if you're going to go ahead and have to make 3 levels of assumption as to why someone answered that way, oh, holy crap, that's a bad precedent to set. I've seen those conversations. I've been a part of those conversations where people go, well, it's probably that they're this. And, it's probably that women don't like this as much as men. And it's like, did we ask why they said what they said? So I had a client recently who had 2 colors that they were choosing in between for a logo and for an identity. And it was part of a bigger survey. But right after that, I said, you have to have a why after why they picked the color that they did, or else you're just going to go, well, they must like the blue because it's more vibrant. Well, maybe they actually like it because they hated the other one and they don't like either one that much, right? And I've seen that kind of thing happen with a why, where I'm giving you 2 things to choose from that I think are great. And then when you ask an open end, people can say, I didn't like either one of these, actually. I'm sorry. I just kind of picked the one that was the least of the 2 evils, right? And then, wow, what a learning that you never would have gotten had you not used it. Sometimes in surveys, my biggest tip is that if you want more than people to say good, fine, it's great, ask them to write a sentence. Just ask them for what you want. Write 1 to 2 sentences about why you feel that way, right? Or define in 1 to 2 sentences why that matters to you, right? Just asking them straight up for what you need, it can be very helpful. So kind of, where just a why can elicit a quick response, that's fine if you want a quick response. Why did you choose the one that you did? Very straightforward. But if you want people to think about it and you say, write a sentence, slightly more people will actually do it. Good rules of thumb for any survey is 25 questions or less. Man, I have taken, and I think you all have taken, 50-question surveys, segmentation surveys, big surveys. There's just no way you're not speeding through some of that. There's no way you're thinking about every single response. And because you guys are going to be basing so much on these things, you want people to think about every single response they give. You do not want them speeding through. Right around question 15 is where people start to fatigue. If you have a 25-question survey, you're going to start pulling demos somewhere around 18 to 20, and that's perfect. That's a good length for people. If you have a lengthier survey than that, make 2 freaking surveys, right? Like, just break it up rather than jamming it all into one. Think like a respondent. You're not just testing it as yourself, but sort of test it as if you didn't create them, or have someone else test them with a critical eye. Simplest language. I think, look, we're all in business, especially for people in tech. And Daniel, you talked a little bit about coming from Microsoft. I would see this all the time, where they would put together a survey that had technical language in it. And that's fine if you're talking to someone technical, but a lot of times they weren't. Sometimes they were talking to business decision makers. Well, all of that tech language should come out at that point, and you should put it in the simplest terms possible. Vagueness is a big deal in surveys, as much as misunderstanding. There's just a myriad of ways you could be misinterpreted. What is important to you about X product? Is it what is important to me when I'm buying the product or when I'm using the product, right? Like, there's just some vagueness in there that you could help clean up and really get a better survey result question from, right? It's not just how do you feel about X? It might be, how do I feel about, this purchase process for this? Or how do I feel about the after, I've used this product, that kind of thing. The logic within something like a SurveyMonkey or a Qualtrics, which are some of the survey platforms, it can disappear when you make edits. You just have to be really careful. Anytime you're making a change, it can actually change your logic that you've set in. So be sure to test it one final time, totally clean before you complete it and send it out, right? So just make sure, you know, survey logic being that thing that's if you answer a certain way, I can show you a question that no one else will see as a follow-up to that. So the easiest example of that is a yes or no question with an open-end follow-up. You just have to test that programming and make sure it's working. You know, you can be informal in your language. I think sometimes people think of surveys as very formal and they have to be, you know, very specific. You know, that's true. You want to sort of just, you know, be colloquial though. Don't be off-putting. I think, you know, the other thing that being colloquial forces you to do is to use simple language. You kind of can't be overly technical or overly, you know, lugubrious in your business speak if you're just trying to be nice. So think about being informal. Business or marketing speak is a big no-no. And then just randomize your answers all the time. It's a little thing, but I see it very often where unless there's some kind of numeric spread where you're saying less than one, but more than two, and then, you know, that can stay in order. But if I have pick an adjective that describes most how you feel about this, and those adjectives don't rotate, the ones near the top will get picked more. It will happen. So you just have to make sure that what they're seeing, it doesn't have order bias or order primacy, which is just part of taking surveys. People just, they can't help themselves. It's not intentional, but they will subconsciously give you bad data if you forget to do something small like that. So you have to randomize. When it comes down to survey tools, some survey tools allow that and some don't. So a lot of times when you're picking a survey tool, you've got to look at the features that they offer, and answer randomization for some of the cheapy, like freest survey tools don't have that. And that is a really big deal. It can lead you to having some inappropriate data. Okay, so that's my basics. Any questions on the basics, or is that all pretty clear?
Could we talk a little about the randomizing the answers?
Yeah. So basically you're going to come up in your, you know, you're going to have your question. And then if it's a closed-ended question, you're going to have a set of answers that you populate, you know, and that is basically just a function within the tool that you're building in. Well, you will see a checkbox that says randomize these answers. And that will basically mean that each person's seeing them in a different order every time. Yeah. So that way they're not seeing order bias.
But you know, typically a survey is shown to a person, a respondent only once, right?
Yeah.
So why is this randomization important?
Yeah. So what basically would happen over time is the things near the top, people are more likely to pick, especially if something appears in pole position or first. And so what you would see is just a little bit more of an affinity for things that appear in that upfront position as opposed to further back. I don't think it would skew your data so out of this world, but it could. If your best thing was listed last, it may come out near the bottom just because it requires people to scroll or because people are more engaged at the beginning of every question. So yeah, what it means is just better data on the back end. It doesn't mean anything to the respondent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you go in a little bit to how, whether to or how to ask proxy questions, which sort of like the example I put in the chat was, if I ask for a LinkedIn address, then I can scrape data off the LinkedIn address and get some information about where they work, how long they've worked, all of those things without asking what's your job title and how long have you worked there. I just took one thing. Is that something you should do, and can you do that in a way that's effective?
Yeah, so it's a great question because so much of what you guys are going to be doing is audience oriented. You know, with demography, you want to ask only what you want to cut the data by. So remember that when you're building out your demographic section. If you're not going to cut the data by it, there's probably not a reason for it to be there. So in spirit of keeping it short, you know, something like what John's talking about could be helpful. You know, you want to know more about someone, you want to be able to reach out to them again. A lot of times I'll just ask for an email, frankly. You know, usually people's emails have their first and last name in it. So if I want to recontact people, which is essentially what we're talking about, because you would love to see if you could understand Jane further and give her more money later to talk to you again in an in-depth, just say, hey, if you would be interested, and of course they have to opt in at the end of a survey. Thank you for taking the survey. If you are interested in, and this is basically your last question, if you're interested in being contacted for further research that would also be paid, please enter your first and last name as well as your email address, and we'll, follow up with you if you qualify, kind of thing. Not the assumption that we'll follow up with you, because then people might wonder why you haven't, but just more, if you qualify and you sort of meet our requirements for who we want to speak to, we'll be back in touch. What that allows you to do, and in this today's day and age, a lot of people's emails include their first and last name. So it's an easy way to sort of go find out on their LinkedIn page and things like that if you do want to go deeper. That said, it is also simple to just follow up with 5 additional questions into somebody's inbox if you need a little more about them too. So that's why email, I think, can be super helpful. If you just go, hey, I'll send you another $5 Starbucks gift card if you answer these 5 questions, and you have 5 targeted questions around, their kids in schooling that you didn't ask in your first survey. So that can be just as effective, because then you've got their email, and that's a great way to get in touch with people again for a follow-up. Sometimes that follow-up can just be, maybe you screwed up in your survey and you forgot to put a big why in somewhere where you really needed one, and now you're kind of stuck. You don't have the ability to necessarily exactly tell why people said what they said. That's having an email address to follow up is a great way to get around your own, missteps in a survey. To go back and say, hey, Jane, I noticed that you put that you liked the orange color better, but I forgot to ask you why. Do you mind letting me know? That kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, LinkedIn profiles are a good way just to reach people in general, because people tend to be open to more professional contacts on that, and therefore a research request doesn't feel as foreign as it might otherwise. But you also have to be cognizant that any request for data at all will cause a huge drop off in your survey. So, that's why usually at the end of the survey, I will do something like, hey, if you would like to be contacted further, drop your name and your email, but the more, the 2 questions that cause the most survey drop off in demos are ethnicity and household income, right? They're personal questions. They start to bother people. They start to feel a little invasive. And if that feels invasive, entering something like my LinkedIn profile might feel very invasive. So, as long as it's not required, I would never make something like that a required question. And giving people a reason for stuff is ultimately the best way to get them to do it. Here is the reason I am asking, and just being really transparent around like, hey, this survey is largely about trying to find an audience for products. I'd love to know more about you without bothering you again. If you can, just drop your LinkedIn here. Probably wouldn't be a terrible ask, although I wouldn't expect a huge uptake.
So we know that both LinkedIn and Facebook do pretty good modeling of who the customer is at some level. And so by asking for a Facebook link, I can know something about politics and income and other things, or at least I used to be able to know more. And so I was trying to think where those might be. If I have their email address, can I then go discover a bunch of data about them that allows me to do that categorization process? Because in the beginning, I may not have subsegments identified, right?
Yep.
I need to find some kind of anchor.
Survey
I don't really
sample,
ask 50 questions, right?
Totally. Survey sample companies should have that information, right? So on the back of each take, if you work with a survey sample company, they will have a code that follows that person throughout the entire survey, so that they can pay them when they finish, because you're not paying them a lot of times. If it's a survey sample company, they pay them directly. And so one time I had a total travesty example where I had someone program my survey. It was a super rush thing. They sent it out. It was basically a time I subcontracted something, and they forgot to put demography on the back. And I was like, oh my God, we have to redo the entire survey, and I'm going to eat so much money, and I'm just not going to make any money on this project. And the client isn't going to, know about it, but it is not great. And the survey company pulled all of the demographic information off of their back end, and we were basically able to match it back to who had taken the survey and able to sort of save the day in the end, right? So that's an example of the fact that they have a lot of that information sitting around. It is their job, if they are a good panel, and that's a big if, they will reach out to these people multiple times a year and make sure, oh, are you still an accountant? Are you still at this address? You know, do you still work at this place? You know, all of those things that are really important to them, because if you want a sample of accountants and you get a guy who left his accounting job to go work at a pizza shop, that's not going to be relevant to you. The ones who kind of aren't as good and maybe are a little less diligent on their panel may have old data from people. You know, data from people when they entered it originally. And for some of them that aren't that diligent, that could have been years ago. So, you know, you really want a company that refreshes. And so as you're picking a company, that can become really important if you do choose to buy sample, to say to them, how often are you verifying that you know, someone hasn't gone from a job where they were making 25,000, let's say they were a grad student, and now they're making $150,000, but they're answering your survey as if they, you know, because I wanted people who are low income, right? So important to ask that question. And what that helps you do on the back end is to harvest some of that information. If you say to them, okay, here's all the unique IDs of the people who took the survey, it'll probably be a small fee for them to go into their systems and to do some of that harvesting, but not much. So, you know, if you say, I don't know how many of them had kids because I didn't ask, survey company, can you tell me how many of these households have children? Yes, they can.
Right. So are you going to talk more about selecting that company, or is now a good time to ask a question about that?
I have that's in the deployment section, which is actually our third section.
Okay, I'll wait.
Okay. Don't forget it though, write it down. Okay, second is finding the audience. Look, you know, this is the trolling the net question, which, like I've said from the beginning, isn't the greatest way in the world to conduct research. I much prefer it when there's sort of a set demo that we can reach out to. But if you're doing that, you know, just as far as writing the survey, there's a couple ways in that I was thinking of that are purely speculative. But if you're in a situation where you're trying to help people get to your solution by seeing if they have a problem identification is a fine thing to do in a survey. It tends to be best for sort of more novel, you know, solutions to problems that people, but still problems people can articulate. There's a lot of times that you might have a solution that people don't have an itch to solve yet because they don't know it. It's a pain point for them yet. But if people can kind of say, when I try to open the can opener, it jumps off the can and it never quite opens the can easily on the first turn, well, then that's great. They can articulate that, and I can ask about current positives of their experience. Hey, tell me about some of the best things about using a can opener. I can also ask them, what are some of the worst things about using a can opener? As opposed to, as we talked about with impartiality, just starting with what are the worst things about using a can opener? You also kind of need to sort of make sure you're getting both sides of it and breaking those into two questions. What are the positives? What do you really love about it? And what are some of the negatives? Then, you know, once you have as comprehensive of a list of issues as possible, you can help determine sort of if that is sort of quantitatively pronounced. So for instance, you know, if you have sort of every kitchen sink laundry list example of what could possibly go wrong with a can opener, you know, great. Narrow that down to the 20 that you might assume are most important. Make sure you have your other please specify in there and stack it high and let it fly. If you don't have a sense of what could go wrong with a can opener, that probably has to be an open end, right? You probably have to say, you know, what are some of the issues that that you could have had opening a can opener? Please list all that you can think of, right? Sometimes you might want to do both. There, in awareness surveys, there's aided and unaided awareness, right? A lot of times the unaided awareness is where you start. Hey, name a bunch of companies that make toothpaste. Usually people can only name 2 or 3, but that way you have a sense of what's at the top of their head. Then you ask them an aided question where you close it down and you have maybe 10 to 12 toothpaste brands for them to choose from. And you say, select all that apply. Which of these are you aware of? Which of these have you heard of? Then what you get is sort of the comparison list. What's top of mind for them comes from the open end. And then once I give them some other more concrete examples, which ones are they picking, right? So you could choose to do a two-stepper for something where you let people articulate the open-ended problems that they have with a can opener, and then you give them the laundry list. It kind of just depends on your situation, which way you want to handle it. You know, obviously, you know, the frustration level is always an interesting question. You don't want to make an assumption that these issues frustrate them, so you got to be careful in your wording. But you know, having a balanced scale for answers is important. So if you say, I find it very frustrating, is your first response to a question like, how frustrating is it when this issue happens to you? You know, very frustrating, if that's your first one, somewhat frustrating, not frustrating nor non-frustrating, you know, is that middle neutral option. And then, you know what? Actually, I don't find it frustrating needs to be the back end of your scale. I'm not frustrated by that even a little bit. I'm not frustrated about it at all. You know, those kinds of, you know, yeah, you know, like it doesn't bother me need to be in there as well. It can't just be on a scale of 1 to 5. How frustrated does this make you? Because I may not be frustrated, right? It may be an issue that I have, but not one that bothers me. So just make sure you're balancing your scales. But you know, what I like to do when I'm sort of trying to figure out if people have a problem is once they identify, okay, here's the 4 things I checked in your list, you can program it so that each of those things, I then get a frustration annex question on, you know, on a scale of, you know, very frustrated to not frustrated at all. How do you feel when this particular issue happens? Okay, how do you feel when this particular issue happens? Same question, but piped in is the response that they already gave. So that's a good example of logic really working to your advantage. And then you might offer your solution for feedback. Look, I'm very much in the camp of like, put it out there. If your question is really going ultimately towards how likely would you be to like tofu snacks, then absolutely put your solution out there at the very end, not at the beginning, but at the end of the survey, once you've gotten some information from them in an open-ended manner, because at that point you have them, what do you have to lose? Like, right, it's like they're here. Even if you ask one question after they read your concept, great. There's a use case weigh in. This could be really about sort of, you know, a product or service category that they're familiar with is sort of, sorry, what that should read at the end. So that could be for something like an app, like, you know, hey, tell me about how it was to get financially certified by the FDIC. Oh, it was really, really hard. Maybe you actually have them put a step-by-step into a survey, right? Here was step 1 that I did, and maybe there's a list of different steps, but you have them mark them in order, right? A lot of times in survey programming, they have an ordering tool, which basically means you can set up your answer blank so that people have to rank the number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. And they can assign that to any of your answers. So for something like, you know, what process do you usually use when you're getting financially certified? You know, I do research on my options, whatever it is. That will allow them to rank steps. And then you kind of have almost a journey from there that they go through. I consider this, I consider this, I consider this, I consider this. You can then leverage those later as you go through your survey and just sort of say, you mentioned that this particular thing you labeled as number 1, which we've now piped back to you, is something that you did in looking for a survey or a financial provider, you know, or sorry, no, it was financial certification. Why did you do that? Right. And then you have an open end there to sort of capture that information. A competitive weigh in is if there are products and services that have a pretty vibrant competitive presence. You know, in the world of snacking, you're in a really broad category. It's a hard one, but healthy snacks is a competitive kind of area that I know I can play in, right? And that people can articulate without sort of leading the witness, right? So I had a smoothie client that's one of the largest smoothie retailers in the country. They were looking at healthy snacking. And we asked that question in a bunch of different ways, but the first question we asked people was open-ended. You know, when it comes to healthy snacking, name the first 3 products you think of as your go-tos, right? We got that response, and then we kind of progressively moved them through, you know, tell me what is, you know, what you're looking for when you're thinking about purchasing a healthy snack. Is it, you know, of course we know convenience, we could probably pull that one out. People are always looking for convenience when they're looking for a healthy snack, but what I might mean by that is no mess, that I can eat it in my car, what do we mean by convenience? Well, that kind of thing becomes a different attribute that I could put in a big long list, right? No fat, those kinds of attributes. The other thing, is that you can just ask about a competitor. So if, for instance, you have tofu snacks, but you know that tofu jerky is a really big deal for this audience, you may say, okay, I'm going to start my survey just asking about tofu jerky because that's the nearest thing to mine. I don't know, I'm making this up. And therefore, I kind of want to know what people's perceptions of that are before I say, hey, here's the alternative to that. That's so much better, right? Here's the improved version of tofu jerky or what it might be. So sometimes this is helpful for tech. A lot of times, tech is just like the Uber of blank, is often the thing you hear. So yeah, like often having a competitive way in can be helpful for people to start to get a baseline and for you to start to find out what are their problems with that competitor, especially if there's an 800-pound gorilla competitor sitting in the space already. That is the toughest. If I was looking to go into invoicing, I would need to contend with Intuit. I would need to know what are the problems people are having with Intuit. What are the issues that they're currently having? Because maybe my entire marketing campaign will just be built upon that eventually, and my service structure and my fees, right? So, kind of understanding a different ways in can be helpful. To get to needs, you might think of it as a sequence, almost like I did when I talked to you guys about the open end of like, tell me about all the healthy snacks that you can think of. And then sort of, maybe my next question is, which category of healthy snacks have you bought in the last year? Hard-boiled eggs, cheese, single cheese snacks, but then I may ask a question about, well, which of those are your favorite, right? Because that's a different level of questioning. You're almost sort of doing that broad to narrow, right? Why are those your favorite? Okay, now that I've established why are those your favorite, what is there that you would like to have out there that you can't currently get, right? Or what is a snack that you make at home that you really think is a healthy snack that you can't find on the go? That's a good open-ended question, right? Where people might talk about ants on a log. I love to have, celery with peanut butter and raisins on it, but I would never get that out because no one's going to have something like that, right? You may, figure out something from that as to, oh, okay, people have these certain things at home that they can't get on the go.
Or it's too messy.
Right, exactly, right? The example, and that's actually interesting because some of my clients have flirted with the idea of toast. Toast became very popular, as you guys know, at restaurants, right when avocado toast was taking off, they were like, what else can we put on toast? We can put healthy stuff on toast. We can put peanut butter, we can put egg. And then, they had to figure out how are we going to make this something that people can eat on the go, right? So that was a big problem. Anyway, back to example sentences here are, maybe you start in a very open-ended way. That's what I like to do. That's my preference. Write 1 to 3 sentences outlining your typical interaction with blank in the past couple of months, right? Whatever that might be, whether that's the competitive product or whether that's sort of a use case scenario around some kind of service. And then, which of the following do you enjoy most? Which of the following things do you sort of feel like, didn't go smoothly? Have you ever had an interaction that didn't go smoothly? I like a yes or no before I start to introduce issues to them. Yes, I have had something that didn't go smoothly. Okay, now think about the ones that didn't go smoothly. Of that on this list, which were the things that you had an issue with? Check all that apply, right? And then you could go into your frustrations, and then you could go into how often, right? You could say, have a matrix across and, I've experienced this less than, 0 times. I've experienced this 1 to 2 times. I've experienced this 3 to 4 times, and so on, right? Because I think the other thing you can want maybe sometimes is not just severity of how much it impacts me, but also frequency if I'm looking for an issue.
So when you have those lists and you have the blah, blah, blah list of choices, and you create the list, you are now leading the witness, essentially.
Yeah.
So what's the mechanism by which I could let them create the list?
Yeah.
And then sort of recycle it and come back and get that filtered again. So does it make sense, for example, to run a survey against 100 people, try to build the list, and then run a survey against 1,000 people with the list predefined and sort of compare those 2 different things as a sequence of surveys instead of trying to guess all the possible answers out of your head?
You've identified the number one problem in quantitative surveys. You will only get the answer to what you ask. It is not a qualitative thing where you could say, how do you feel about this? And someone could actually tell you, oh, I picked that, but not for the reason that you think. I actually picked, you know, I've found this to be, you know, insufficient because I tried to call customer service once and they were really mean to me. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with the product, right? You can get to that in qualitative, but in quant, you really can't. If people say that one thing, that's sort of what it is, which is why you have to be so careful. An easy way to get around it is to have an open end first, right? Is to say, list all the problems that you think you've had with X. The other thing is really to make sure that you're just thinking really hard through tangibles, intangibles, reasons that you don't even think are relevant, but are red herrings. I put those in all the time, right? Things that I think could not even play there. You know, I just finished a survey for a utility client, and, you know, they wanted to put forward a list of factors that might be why people choose or choose to stay with a utility. And it was, here was all the list of factors. And I said, you know, have you ever thought about, like, gives back to the community, is a local company? You're a local company, you just happen to be a utility. And they were like, why would we include those? It's really going to be about price and reliability and all those things. But they were listing all the tangibles. And I inserted a lot of intangibles, and a lot of intangibles came back. Because people would write in their open ends after that of like, why did you say that? Well, they've given to my kid's softball team. Comcast is not my favorite, but they've given to my kid's softball team, or whatever it is, right? So there are factors that you know, on first blush, you're going to leave out. So yes, it could be, you know, to your point, to have multiple could be a solution to that. To do some qualitative ahead of your quant, I always recommend to try to find 5 people who you'll talk to about that can opener and the problems they have with it, because a lot of times your framing isn't their framing. What that also allows you to do is to use their words. So if they're describing opening a can opener and they go, you know, it jumps off, it seems to jump off, but the way you describe it is, you know, it has a failure of the rotary mechanism. You know, if you put in the survey, it has a failure of the rotary mechanism, no one's going to mark it. But, you know, their way of describing that in their language as a layperson is it jumps off the can, right? And so now I know that I can put jumps off the can in my list of things, even though I know that that's not really what happens, but that's the way consumers frame it. So there's 2 aspects of that, John. It's consumer framing in their language that can be helpful to get ahead of time. If you have to, sometimes that can be FOF, that can be friends and family, right? Like, just use this can opener and talk to me about all of the problems that you could see having with it, every single problem that you could imagine, and then just really sort of working to prioritize that and strip that down. That can be helpful because if they don't work in tech or they don't work in snacking, they probably have other, you know, words to describe things than you do, right? Like, you may think like, oh, everyone's talking about keto, I have to have keto in my survey, you know, and at the end of the day, you know, that's sort of less important to someone than like, well, actually, I still look at calories, and you're thinking, oh my God, nobody's looked at calories in the food industry in something like 5 years. Like, that's just so dated. But that's still the consumer way of thinking about it, right? So just sort of be aware that, like, you being also on top of your industry are going to have some biases about what belongs there that people who may be 5 years behind you in their thinking or may have layperson ways of describing things may not say. So I personally think the best survey has a little bit of talking to a human ahead of time. So that's probably what I would do, John, rather than like spending the money fielding multiple times. I would probably take a couple of in-depth conversations with a few different demos and then go, okay, now I'm feeling good about my list. And then maybe even taking that list back to them to have them scrub it again, right? To say, hey, you did my can opener experiment. Here's how I phrased some of the issues when I wrote them that you were having. Did I capture them right? Well, it's like, no, you said, you know, that the rotary mechanism failed, but I said it jumped off the can, right? So you can also get that extra preview, especially if they're FOF, or you can pay for those respondents as well. I'm sure there's something you'll want to ask people that you can also get that feedback, on the use case that you want to ask about.
So
long answer, but is
when
that
I talk? No, yeah, that's perfect. I was hoping you would go one more step deeper in the following way. At the beginning, when you're writing the survey, I agree with you using the words in the context of what they say about the product, not what you say about the product. And so where can I go to do the deep listening about them talking about the thing?
Yeah.
And my default back the hand answer is, if you can't find a consumer complaining on Reddit about your thing,
Yes.
there's no market.
Yep.
And so there's certain places where if you just go to the right subreddit, that subreddit has lots of stuff in it, and you can mine that place for the thing that you care about, right? Which is specifically, what words do I describe what's not working for me?
Yep. Twitter.
And then, right. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit.
Yep. That's it. I mean, that's what we used to do in advertising when we were kind of wondering what it is that motivates people to do things. That's a really strong place to look. People are often posting in the moment. Nothing really replaces that, right? There is mobile surveys and things like that, which are helpful. But again, like, that's if you want to pay for it. But, sometimes those can be cheap. They can be sort of mobile phone things where you're just asking 2 questions and you're asking people to use a can opener and then talk to camera for 60 seconds while you do it. And if that's all you're doing and it's that short and things like that, you don't have to pay them a ton of money. And you're just doing it to general market. So you could find a company that's like, yep, we do mobile surveys where it's sort of in the moment responses on video. And then you can get 10 people opening a can and talking to you about the problems they have as they do it. Right. So those kinds of things, if you're like, ooh, I don't know about asking my friends and family, they're all kind of, overly educated business people. Well, then that can be a way to get to just other people, just regular people. The other thing, of course, in pre-COVID times is like just walking out into the marketplace is also a great way to do this. It's sacrificing yourself on the altar of dignity every time. It's terrible. It's terrifying. But on places where people have a little bit of time to kill, maybe they're at a mall and their wives are going to be popping in and out of stores. Maybe they're at an outdoor shopping center and they're heading toward the food court and they are just spending a ton of money. So your $20 gift card to get their afternoon Starbucks sounds really good. Just asking people there. If you have a grocery product, don't discount standing in the aisle. Do not discount that. Standing in the healthy snacks aisle with $5 Starbucks gift cards, getting permission from a local store manager isn't nearly as hard as you think. I've gone through the channels where I've gone through corporate for that. It never makes it down to the store level anyway. And I have a letter saying, Whole Foods is allowing me to be here, and they never ask to see, and they don't give a shit. But if you ask the manager, hey, I'm doing a little study for a project I'm working on, I'm going to spend $50 before I leave your store and product, and I'm going to buy some gift cards that I can give to the people who I'm working on the study for, and then I'll be here for 10, 15 minutes and then I'm out. They'll probably say yes. So it's a really easy way to sort of like get really quick intelligence, is just like stop people in the street, stop people where they have extra time or where they're looking for that little bit of extra money. There was once a coffee shop that was having a problem where they were noticing that the flow through their coffee shop was not working. They didn't know why. I stood at the door. I offered people a $15 gift card to answer 10 questions, and we solved their problem in an afternoon.
I love your phraseology of the altar of dignity.
Yes,
I know that.
it's terrifying, and it's over in just a few hours, right? Like, it is just the worst, and people will be mean to you, and it will be. And so in the post-COVID world, there is a place for that. Especially if you're lucky enough. Unfortunately, Daniel isn't quite as lucky. He can't just stop people in the street about his financial product, but you can. He could do that at a conference, though. Daniel, think about that kind of thing too. I don't pay for booze or things like that at conferences, but breakfast and happy hour, are great opportunities to talk to folks about that kind of thing. And so sometimes I paid for a conference ticket, not because I give a fig about the content, but because I want access to that audience. And if you have your stuff narrowed down to 5 questions, then you don't have to go to the sessions. You can hang out in the back near the food.
So 5
The
questions, one
hallway
gift card.
track.
That's it.
Yeah, a lot of times that's exactly it. It'll be like 5 questions for $5 to $10 on a Starbucks gift card, and you get such great information.
Cool.
Yeah.
We once had a startup weekend where we had a food company that was trying to do something, and it was food week. And so all of the downtown stores, restaurants had lines of people lined up to go. They just worked the queues of the people waiting to get in the restaurants.
Yep.
And in 4 hours, they had 250 customer contacts going through and asking a couple of questions of each of the folks.
That's
and
exactly
then
right.
the next day they did a pop-up restaurant, and they served 250 items, right? So it was something that they did on the fly. And so when the opportunity is there, where there are people sitting there waiting for the thing that you want to do, you get a very high density audience.
Yeah, something like Pike Place, right? It's full of tourists. The great thing about Pike Place is everybody's from somewhere other than Seattle. So the minute that you want something that is not Seattle specific, but you want kind of a national sample, well, you can't get it on the street, but you can get it in the most touristy places we have, the Space Needle, Pike Place. And you can sit there and say, hey, I'm going to give you, a $20 Visa gift card you can start spending now, right? Any retailer here, if you answer these 10 questions or whatever, and people will do it. I always used to use Faneuil Hall when I was in Boston because of that same reason. You'd ask people where they're from, and they were never from Boston. So, yeah. When you're putting your idea out there, this just comes from spades of research background. You're not putting it out there probably in the way you would to a potential investor. You're putting it out there to a layperson, and that's very different. And so just a reminder that 3 sentences or less, and that's it. Just stop. Don't do any more. If you can't do it in 3 sentences, they will not read it. They're taking a survey, especially when you're in that click mindset. Anything that I have to read, I may speed read. So be aware that every word has to be impactful, and it has to be so short. I wouldn't even write 3 contiguous sentences ever in a survey. I would write 1 sentence, space, 1 sentence, space, 1 sentence. That's how much people are sort of in a quicker mode when they're in a survey. Things like bullets, right, can be really great, but no more than 3 bullets, or they're just going to stop reading. You don't, unlike a qualitative sample, you don't have people's full undivided attention for long before they're looking for that next question they can click and answer, right? So you've got to make sure that you're keeping it really brief. Superlatives and things like that don't fly well with consumers. You may be doing that for investors. You may say, I am the best. I am 10 times greater than the average. But unless that's tied to a really specific benefit, consumers don't care, and it makes them mad. And so regardless of what your product is, they can dong you for that, right? They can be like, nope, I'm not going to give this guy a good rating because he said his product was the best. So just be aware of some of their biases. And that is one I see every time, is superlatives are fine if you say I'm 10 times faster than the competitor. That's something that seems fair and they can get their heads around. But saying, you're going to have 100 times better experience with my product, forget it. They're going to roll their eyes and hate you for it. Really anything that sounds like marketing to them when you're trying to describe a product or service is a big turnoff. At the same time, you have to do it in a way that's appealing to them. But just remember that the more you sing your own praises, it's going to make them stand back a little more. But if you give your benefits with your lead foot, that is going to attract them more, right? So I think a lot of times when you're trying to attract investors and people to pay attention and fund your product, it can be very attribute driven. It can be listen to why I'm better than the 800-pound gorilla in the room. When you're talking to consumers, let's say we have our example of going against Intuit, they'll kind of go well, what's wrong with Intuit? Why are you trying to go after them? That's mean. I don't like that. That's mean spirited. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the point at all. So if you want to keep them focused and not distracted and nitpicking on your language, really putting it out there as sort of benefit to them driven as possible, and as succinctly as possible, and without making yourself sound like I'm the next $1 billion startup idea. Let me tell you about it, which I know you have to go do when you're talking about getting to people who can give you money. But this is a really different audience.
Actually, no. Everything you just said is what you need to do for investors. You just have to sell the company, not the product. But you have to be succinct. You don't want to give them lots of marketing speech because they will do the same thing you just said.
Yeah.
But you have to understand the difference between selling a slice of your company and selling your product. And if you don't understand that, the conversation goes to the side rails real quick.
Yeah.
But lots and lots of details that people can get lost in, superlatives, giving all of that is a distraction from, is this a good deal that does great things?
Yeah.
Right? And
You're sort of giving people something to argue about, right? If I tell you I'm the best, your first instinct is to say, well, why are you the best? Why do you think you're the best, right? But if I give you an example, oh, you know, Fortune 5 companies have hired me, even though I'm a little dog in the pond. You know, that might make you go, she's pretty good, right? So like you can offer a concrete proof like that to get around some of people's kind of instinct, which is to say, who the hell do you think you are? And trust me, when they're looking at new stuff, that's the first thing they think, unfortunately, you know, it just is. The last tip, of course, is that your product or service doesn't take up as much of their brain space as yours. So just adjust accordingly, you know. I again know that, you know, I appreciate, John, you sort of grounding, but like, you know, the tofu snack probably isn't going to change their life. It's probably not going to change their snacking life forever. So backing off of some of that language and just kind of saying what it can be for them and what it can do for their day is probably better places to live in, right? Even though in the long term, you may dang well know it's going to change their health in some meaningful way over 10 years. It may drop their blood pressure. I have no idea, but you know what I mean?
But you're bringing up I think about, you know, something like Daniel's value proposition. I'm like, yes, a tool that does something that nobody else does. I'm like, everybody has gotten by for millennia without this. So I really can't make that claim. So
yeah, it's tough. Snacks are and I've done tons of work in them just because I have so much of a food background. It is just overcrowded. Nobody really feels they need anything else. It is a tough category. I felt for you as soon as you said that, because that is a tough one. Luckily, healthy snacks people still seem to have some unmet needs in healthy snacks. That said, the market doesn't look at all like it looked 5 years ago. I mean, it's just so different, right? You know, people used to literally say, I can't get something that is good on the go, that is sort of, you know, fresh and wholesome and has the nutrients and all the things that I want and isn't going to bog me down. That didn't exist 5 years ago, and now there's a lot of options. Yeah, I did an activity once where I just had them I gave them like $80 to spend at Whole Foods on whatever they wanted, and I said that like 60 of their dollars had to be on things they regularly got, but I wanted them to bring me $20 of what they'd never gotten before but seemed interesting. Because with healthy snacks in stores like Whole Foods, there's a bazillion different examples, but people won't buy something totally crazy without permission sometimes. So that's where you get into some of the innovative shit. Like people would bring in like fresh cod snacks, and I'm like, ooh, fresh cod snacks. Like, what the heck is that? But they never would have bought it. They buy like boiled eggs, right? But when you give them a little money and opportunity and you say, find me something different, they'll find you the most leading edge stuff you've never thought of. So that's kind of a neat tip too, to try to think about, you know, yeah, there's the things people regularly buy, but then there's also the stuff they'll buy when it's not their money. And that's the fun stuff. Yeah. Anyway, it's hard to project into the future. So this was a big conversation that you and I had, John, where I said, people will not be able to tell you at all if they will purchase your product in the future. Ever, not once. They cannot. You cannot believe them if you ask them. That is just BS. Everything they're giving you back is just the yes that you want to hear because they want to be nice. You know, market researchers really have a job, partly because people want to be very nice. And when companies ask people questions, they'll say, yes, yes, of course. Oh, yes, yes. I've been sitting at tables with people in restaurants where the waiter comes around and says, how is everything? And the meal is tragic. It's not even a little like cold, but it is a tragedy on the plate. They hate it. It's been completely improperly made. Maybe it's a fine dining like steak restaurant and they paid $100 for a steak that's a Wagyu steak and it's cold. And they will tell the waiter it's fine, right?
Courtesy bias.
People want to be nice, and and they hate confrontation. So just know that whenever you have a yes, no question, it is so much harder for people to click no that you're gonna get some false yeses, right? So take that construction and now think about this friendly person is paying me to take their nice survey and I'm on question 22 and I just want to be done. And they ask me, hey, do you want to buy this product or service? I'm going to say yes, right? So I never asked that. I've just never once asked, even in a qualitative research place where I could say and call people on their bullshit, I still don't do it. I say, the next time you are thinking about a snack and let's say what your currently available, you know, option just isn't there for you, you know, talk to me a little bit about what you would consider instead and whether or not you might put, you know, something like a tofu snack, if it was there within reach, in the like top 3 of what you might consider. It's a really soft ask, but the reason it's a really soft ask is because it's a realistic ask. You know, for the same smoothie client, we used to do smoothie tastings where you would taste the smoothie and, you know, it's lunchtime, you haven't eaten all day and you taste a delicious pomegranate smoothie. And then I ask you if you're going to buy it, you're going to say yes. It's delicious, right? But if I say, hey, next time you're out and about and you realize you can't, sometimes I'll actually put a specifically high bar on it. I'll basically say, if you were at home and could you see yourself wanting this so badly that you would put the keys in your car, turn it, and go to, in this case, Jamba Juice, specifically to get it? You know, I'll put that high bar out there. I'm not saying, hey, you're already at Jamba Juice for your regular smoothie and you see this pomegranate smoothie, maybe you want that instead. But could you see yourself specifically driving to get this because you love it so much? That was what I did for them, partly because they were looking at increasing in their specific needs, increasing visits. They weren't looking at necessarily swap outs. They didn't care about swap outs. So sometimes things like that are a way of basically saying, are you really going to get it? Or you just say you're going to get it?
Is it that special?
Yeah, you have to go that extra mile. And that's frankly where a lot of people who were like, yes, yes, I like this a lot, would say, yeah, probably not. You know, realistically, Megan, probably not. And I like that. That's what I want to hear. I want to know realistically if they could see themselves doing something. So disappointment, how would they feel if this was no longer available? That's a little tough for you guys because you guys are coming in new. But, you know, for somebody who has a more innovative product like Daniel, you know, he's in a circumstance where, you know, you're going to maybe blow people's minds and tell them there's this way to do things they've never done before. And then say, you know, if this startup didn't, you know, wasn't able to get to market, how disappointed would you be on a scale of 1 to 10? You know, might be a way of sort of getting at purchase without the nice bias, you know, because that actually forces people into the negative, which means they're not going to frame it just from the positive. It's just a mental trick. When you force them into the, like, how sad would you be if this went away? It's a different ask that doesn't just allow them to go, yes, of course I would buy it, right? You know, the other thing I'll often ask is, you know, if there is an 800-pound gorilla like Intuit isn't going anywhere. So you often have a complacency bias there that you have to overcome. And especially things like, you know, that are just kind of givens, like, why would I change, you know, Intuit? I've used them for years. Sometimes you have to hedge of, like, if Intuit disappeared and failed, if Intuit was no longer available to you and you had to search for another option, would this thing, as I've read it to you, be something that could potentially be part of what you consider, yes or no, right? Sometimes you have to dislodge people's current state if they're really complacent. And don't forget that most product, loyalty is just complacency, right? So, sometimes they just have no reason to stop buying Colgate. They bought Colgate since they were 6 years old. And if you're like, yeah, if Colgate wasn't around anymore, that's going to be a sort of artificially inflated number when you see it. But you also know whether or not, that complacency bias can really, be overcome.
So in the beginning, we're trying to get customer number 1 or customer number 10, not trying to do volume.
Yeah.
And so instead of being a soft consider, I would suggest that a hard consider is the other one. Like, like for Paul's stuff, he's going to go run a series of these things and he's going to produce some, and it's going to be very limited test, right?
Yep.
So would you like to be customer number 1 and get my first sample? Or would you like to be customer number 10? And it's going to cost you $10 or $50. Will you pay me right now $10 to be customer number 1 or 10 or 100? And I'm just sorting you into are you an early adopter, or are you a late early adopter, or are you a normal person that's going to want 1,000 people to like it before you buy it? And I want the ones that will jump over the fence and then climb the wall. I don't want the ones that want it to be convenient, at least at the beginning, right? So the first, whatever the amount that it takes for you to get to flow, you can ask the hard question of pay me now, or pay me and I will put you on the list for 6 months from now, or pay me and I will let you be in my beta test when this goes live, right? So the front end of the early adopters, the back end of the early adopters, and the front end of the early normal are the 3 piles that I want to get yeses from. And then the laggards, I'm happy for them to be, no. And the innovators, I'm happy to sell them the kit or find out what, invite them to be speakers at my workshops, and, they play a different role. But just sorting the people that are leaning into those 3 piles and asking them to buy a ticket for being in the pile before the product is done, maybe before the product is defined, is completely a reasonable thing. That's the counter pathway that gets you the same answer of this soft consider. And at least for me, the advantage of that is I now know somebody who I can dive deep with because they're committed to the journey because they spent money.
Yeah, especially because you have a prototype, Paul, that puts you in a position to sort of go like, okay, if I have 100 of these, then I can send it to 25 people in the survey who say, actually, instead of paying me, to John's point, I'll give you $1 at the end of this, or $5 at the end of this for access to that. And they're forfeiting something, which is what they were promised coming into it. That could also be an interesting angle for a survey that you're doing that's paid. The other thing is recommend, and also, and John, thank you for bringing that up, because I think the other thing you want to ask at some point in your survey is how quickly they tend to try new things in your space, right? And usually pretty early on, because at the back end, every question you ask in a survey, you can filter by. So at the back end, when you want to know who are my actual early adopters in here, you can find them, cut the data by them, and then look at your results by them. And then within there, you can pinpoint the people who said, I'm the most willing, per John's point, or per any of the other ways you might ask about consideration, right? The other thing is recommend. Recommend is crappy when it comes to NPS. I think Net Promoter Score is not useful. It's largely falling out of favor. It is not my favorite at all. It's partly the scoring and how they statistically do it that's crappy, though. For me, especially in food products, and that's why I think some element of, we have a conversation every day about food. We do, right? We eat food every day. We eat a snack once a day, every day. And chances are in normal life, back in normal times, when you're standing around the water cooler, you're probably talking about the restaurants you went to or this cool new food you tried with your family. Like it was currency. And so part of what I used to say to people in the food area is, you know, would you stick your neck out and recommend this? And I would specifically use language like that, like prickly language. Would you stick your neck out to put your food reputation on the line and recommend this place or not? Because with that, I was deliberately reminding people of the personal risk that comes with that. You know, you can offhand mention something and be like, oh yeah, like I've been using Domino's pizza, you know, maybe you should try them. But, you know, when you really remind people that like when they're actually sort of reflecting on them, they may not say, oh yeah, I would recommend Domino's pizza. You know, whenever I see recommend scores for products that are really pedantic, you know, toothpaste, I sort of go like, no one recommends toothpaste. What are we even talking about? We've framed it in the like in a context it doesn't exist in the world. I've never had a conversation, I'm almost 40 years old, in which anyone has recommended me a toothpaste ever once. So where
or you've gone for recommendation.
Right. I mean, maybe my dentist, right? So like I want to have a very deliberate framing around recommendation. You know, one of the things, you know, Daniel, is, yeah, I could see myself recommending to someone who's also an accountant in my business, hey, have you tried Intuit? You know, in your case, it might be, hey, have you tried this new thing? So those are very much like conversations. I like to put it in those contexts to remind people, like if you were at a trade show next, or you were, you know, talking to someone over lunch and they mentioned something like, you know, they were looking for something like this, would you recommend it, and how ferociously, on a scale of like 1 to 10 or whatever it is. Sometimes you can actually ask people what they would say about it after that question, which I find really useful. So if you lazily put in that you would put a 9 for why you would recommend it, and then I read your open end and it sucks, and you just write, I don't know, it seems good, that's not very helpful, right? And you've maybe seen that you didn't really get a 9 from that person. You didn't really inspire them. But if you get a 9 from someone and their open end of to what would you say about that product if you were recommending it says, I would definitely talk about this feature, how fast it is. That's really important to me. You know that, you know, you almost ask them to sort of pitch your product back to you. I've done that a lot with people in an open end. Because it's really helpful to know, once you've said all your stuff, once they've rated all your attributes, what do they remember at the end of the survey, right? What do they remember as the very last question? If you said, you know, if you were pitching this product and you were in charge, what are the things you would say about it to make people interested in it? Especially if it's been a little while since I've answered those questions about your features and benefits. Sometimes what sticks in their brain is what's different than they first identify. Last but not least, if your thing is completely novel, like God bless you, like writing a survey to try to get people to react to something completely new it's so hard, unless it is a problem that people, you know, understand that they have. Right. So Daniel, your point about like people know that this is a complicated, laborious process. So you're probably in good shape. If it was the iPhone, you know, writing a survey about the iPhone when people were walking around with flip phones, you know, probably of limited value. What I would probably spend my time in a survey on is just diagnosing the problems with those phones, not saying, here's the new iPhone, what do you think? That, you know, that just sometimes needs to be done in a different format than a survey. I'm not saying that it doesn't have value. I'm just saying that you can't just slap up at the iPhone in a survey and hope that people rate it a 10. It's just too novel for them to get their head around. And of course, we understand new bias, right? Neophobia is what that's called. And there's a reason that people have it. It's because we are complacent with our things. So yeah, I would design a different study for you guys. I wouldn't have you use your survey to do, you know, solution parting. I would have it be all focused on problems they're currently having.
So when we're doing customer discovery, we would like to urge people to not talk about their product whatsoever.
Yeah.
Nothing, zero, okay. Right?
So they're never
this is about
floating.
What are the customer subsegments, and I'm trying to figure that out. And I think it would be good to have a little bit of a chat with Paul around that question.
Yep.
Of those subsegments, who are the early adopters that are willing to move? What do they see as a top 3 problem? And again, you know, if it's below the surface on their awareness, this is not a startup yet. You're a nonprofit education company, and there's another path for nonprofit education companies. But if this is a top 3 question, then what do they do now? And out of that comes a whole bunch of other actions that you need to do. And so you're asking them the open-ended questions to give you the words to tell the story about the problem and what's good about this one and bad about this one and what I wish was different.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing I haven't heard yet in this conversation is the aspirational, I'm frustrated because I can't do blah. Right.
Yep.
And so the magic wand question is the one that I am wondering will fit on a quiz, right, or a survey, right? How do if you could wave a magic wand and this was different, how would it be different? What would you have it do?
Yes, and when people are in survey mode, it's hard to get them to do expansive thinking, right? Expansive thinking is so much more like what I like to use my open ends for in a survey is deep whys, or unaided responses. Like here, like name all the problems you've ever had with blah, 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 blah. Expansive thinking can be tough in a survey. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I think a conversation is way better for expansive thinking, right? So if
you would take that magic wand question and you would move it to the one-on-one interview, and you would do the filtering, right?
Yeah, if you can, right? And look, I mean, I'm not saying you couldn't get a flash in the pan, but remember that 2/3 of open-end responses are garbage, even with great sample, even from the best survey providers, because people are just rushing their way through. You know, chances are when you ask an expansive question and you ask people to critically think, you know, it's hard for them to stop and do that when they're in a survey taking task, right? Because they're just their mindset is I'm going to complete this task as they're starting it, not I'm going to generate ideas, right? That said, you know, there's probably ways to, especially if it is a problem that people really know they have, it is more possible to do things like that, right? If it is a widely recognized problem. If I'm Paul and I kind of say, what do you wish was different about healthy snacks? People might just say, you know, I wish they were a little healthier. I wish they were everywhere, you know, things that he can't really do too much about.
Right.
So, you know, it has to be a question, A, that you think you can get a lot of value of when people are going to go to their first thought, right? Because a lot of times in survey, I'm going to my first thought, maybe one level down, and then I'm going to move to the next question. So just kind of keep that in mind. You know, trying to think of another way to ask it in a survey format. Like if you, you know, part of it is because in a problem identification survey, what I want from you is the problem, I'm the solution, right? You know what I mean? I don't want them to come up with a solution. You've got to think about whether you want them to do some of the solutioneering for you. Like I said, I'd rather do that in a conversation in general. But if you have to, think about exactly what you want them to solve. You know, if you give them a very open-ended, very expansive question, you may not get much back. So I would think very hard about like the magic wand being hemmed into a very specific ask. Like you mentioned this was a problem. Now, if you could wave a magic wand and have it fixed, like on a scale of 1 to 10, like you could even do like on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy would you be that this particular problem was getting fixed without necessarily asking them the solution around it too, right? It could be severity of, you know, the severity of the frustration you can match on the back end if there was something that could fix that, you know, and you could do that on a how enthusiastic would you be to recommend it to others, you know, 1 to 10. So yeah, I mean, I struggle because I know that it might be necessary, that you might only have one stage, and you might have to put everything into a survey that you don't want to. So if you do, stack it high and let it fly. I've had clients do like, I want people to design the ideal blank, because that's a great projective technique. I happen to think that's a great projective technique for qualitative. And if I'm asked to do it in quant, my first response is going to be, I don't know if this is a great use of your money, but you're the client. So you ultimately make the decision. And look, if we stack it high and let it fly and put it in and it produces something, great. But it is my job to sort of say, sometimes like, I don't know if we're going to get all that out of it. There may be one or two things we get out of it that are pretty great in a questionnaire of 200 people. Whereas if we just ask 2 people, we could get a more in-depth response.
Well, and I wonder if this is the place where, to John's point, like the philosophy of customer discovery is about understanding the problem and not talking about product. But you mentioned a couple slides back about like an open-ended question at the end, like based on all the things that you've talked about, how would you feel, this problem or this product meets.
Yeah, does that solve for anything? I mean, like, honestly, it just never hurts to throw your stuff out there at the very end. Like I've never, you know what, if you have the question to spare, it's one question. We know that people are fatigued by the time they get there, but stack it high and let it fly. Like that is one that I've never minded, because you never know what you're going to get back. A lot of times, like, I think there is sort of a purity about research, and that's fine. There's also a point in which you're like, hey, at the end of the day, I still have this thing. So it'll be nice to see if people can write one open end about it before I let them go.
And if there's people who say, I would never buy that because X, Y, Z, then at least there's some objections to be able to.
Yeah, I mean, you could really do a scale of 1 to 10 question only with one open end. That's, how likely do you think this would be to solve your issue? Right. Anyway, sorry, with only 10 more minutes left, let me speed through.
It's a good way to do a transition from discovery to validation to find the ones that are leaning in. So it's something that you would filter on to the ones that leaned in on that question would be the ones that you want to validate with later. Anyway.
Yeah. Or ask for their email and name and then actually follow up. Reminder about demography that it's not just age, ethnicity, gender. And John, I'm glad that you mentioned that the survey sample provider can often have some of this on the back end. But remember that if you want to cut by this piece of data, if you need to know if people have children in the home who are between the ages of 9 and 12, you can't just ask if they have children in the home, right? It has to be specific enough. So you might have to have 2 questions around whether I have children if your product is targeted towards a certain age of child, right? That kind of thing. So just remember that it's beyond age, ethnicity, and geography. With something like geography, you have to think about, am I a product that is Eastern Washington and Western Washington? Because those are very different markets. And if I want to cut my data on the back end by Eastern and Western Washington, I have to have the sample on the front end to do that. And I have to know that they may behave differently and they may need different things from me, right? So, if for some reason you were Washington state based, that would be a logical way to cut your geos. If you were a national product where it doesn't matter where you are, you may just have people identify census region, or it may not be important to you at all. It may be more important to you if they're urban, suburban, or rural. Maybe that's the way you want to ask your geography question, because you want to know, in people's self-specification, where do they live? Should I be at the Whole Foods in downtown, or should I be at the co-op in, a rural part of town, right? Those are different things you can get to by asking those questions. So when you think of geography, it's not just state, it's not just zip code. There's 1,000 different ways to cut that cat. So think about what's important to you based on your objective and where you're at. Because if you're in that audience finding place, maybe urban, suburban, rural is more important to you than what state they live in. I had a client recently that was like, I want to know people's political views. And I said, ask them whether they're urban, suburban, or rural, and you'll get it. Asking political views is incredibly divisive and will probably cause people to exit your survey, and you'll get some nasty emails. Just ask people if they're urban, suburban, or rural, and you'll probably be on the right track, right? So there's also proxy questions to get at what you really want. In case that thing is really invasive to ask. Something like income is really invasive to ask. Do you want to ask people's profession instead? Because that's a good way to get around that. If you know someone is an accountant, then you know they make a certain amount of money, right? As opposed to if they're a retail worker, then they make a certain amount of money. So think about that kind of thing.
You've mentioned income sensitive a couple of times, and I haven't done a survey in a while, but I'm just thinking, are you talking about asking a number, or are you even talking about
always ranges? Okay. Yeah, and even still, like it's for whatever reason that, and of course ethnicity are incredibly polarizing questions. You know, it just feels like you're giving away too much for people for whatever reason, and they'll never blink an eye about answering about age. But they do. Like that would be like if I said, instead of like, what ages are your children, I was like, what names are your kids? What are your kids' names? You'd be like, whoa, like this is creepy, right? And for some people that creepy line starts at something like HHI. Although just having a prefer not to answer usually means people won't bounce from your survey, which is really what you're trying to avoid. Like, yeah, let the 1% of people do the prefer not to answer. You're still going to get 99% of them who are giving you that info. But that way you don't get the bounce out. Yeah. Deployment, really quickly, representative versus volunteer sample. I've seen so many companies do the volunteer sample of like, send this to everyone you know. It's I think we know enough now that we didn't even know a few years ago about how biased our own eyes can be, let alone our networks, right? You know, I once had people go through an exercise for LinkedIn where they had to count up the people that weren't in their industry on LinkedIn, and it was like 20% of their network wasn't in their industry directly, right? So, you know, it's not enough to just sort of put it out there on LinkedIn and say, hey, can you help me out? That's not representative. Representative does mean paying for something, which sucks, but it can be controlled for representative population, right? If I do a volunteer sample, chances are I'm going to end up with a lot more women than men. Women are way more likely to take surveys. I can say that with utter confidence. If you stack a survey high and let it fly, it will be 70% female in response before you're done. So don't do that to yourself. Because then you have to go to the back and eliminate some responses and things like that. You just do not want to do it. But if I go through a survey company, they will shut off the female portion of the sample when they get to 50%, and that will be it. And you cannot go over it, right? The projected to market is really about 125. I've seen online when I Google like startup surveys, people say as low as 40. That's not the case. That is absolutely not true. In the 40 to 60 range, if you have one or two sourpusses that put one for everything and dump all over all of your questions by just speed taking it, that can actually impact your final response and give you bad data. When you get up into that 125, even those wonky butts who are just kind of going through it as fast as possible won't be able to ruin your data set. They will be filtered into a population that's buoyant enough to sort of, you know, not be thrown off by that. You know that a general pop sample for about a 25 question survey can be about $4, be $3 to $4 if you just want to talk to everybody and their brother. Remember that they're pricing on how long do I need them for. So if you stay in the 25 question range, you're in cheaper territory. How hard are they to find? Are they CFOs of Fortune 50 firms? That's a way hard get. You're going to have to pay them a lot more money than $4 to take a survey. You're going to have to pay them $50 to take a survey. But, you know, even a BDI, you know, or sorry, a BDM or a TDM, business decision maker, a tech decision maker, can be in the $20 range. Like, that's not too bad, right? Like, that's still way steep. If you want 200 people, woo, it gets expensive fast, but it is at least manageable. You know, when you start to put more factors on, if you say, I only want women who've taken ballet, you know, and are, you know, putting their kids into ballet, it's going to be such a small segment, you're going to have to pay a fortune. And then how affluent they are, you know, talking to doctors, that's a $300 survey suddenly, you know, per person. It gets ridiculous. If you cut your data and you want to cut your data on the back end, just having 125 on the front end doesn't do it. Because if I want, and you guys are trying to find an audience, if I want to cut by 25 to 34 women to see what they said about the survey, and I have 20 of them, it's unstable. I'll be unable to see if they actually were more likely or less likely to like something than a Gen Pop. So you guys may have to increase your survey size knowing, okay, I want to cut on the back by Eastern and Western Washington. Well, Eastern Washington is only 30% of the state. So I have to make sure there's enough sample in that 30% to get a robust read. You can actually choose to oversample when you're dealing with a survey company. You can say, look, I don't want to pay for 2,000 people, but I want to be able to cut by this particular population on the back end. Can you oversample among them? And then what you do in your survey is have the ability to black out the oversample of them, and you can read your results without them or with them. So there's just certain survey tricks within the tools that will allow oversample to happen. If you know you don't want to pay for a crap ton of people just to get that Eastern Washington population where it needs to be, but you just want to oversample it. So the other thing is that, you know, when it comes to survey companies, SurveyMonkey is probably the most obvious one. Qualtrics, actually, I've heard is a little better. A lot of times I use SurveyMonkey just because it's functional across a lot of platforms. Survey Gizmo, Survey Planet, you just have to look at the different attributes they offer. You know, for instance, SurveyMonkey allows you to offer multiple languages to roll into the same survey by allowing them to select the language they want to take it in. You have to be able to hard code that language. It's not easy, but you can do it. And ultimately, therefore, I can offer my survey in English and Spanish and not have to go, here's my English survey, here's my Spanish survey. I can send out a survey and say, if you, in Espanol, if you want to take this in Spanish, you know, go ahead and do this. And then it all goes into the same hopper. So that may be not a need you have, but if so, you're going to want to be with someone who gives you the ability to do that versus, oh my gosh, I have multiple languages. Now what? Because I spent money on a survey provider and they don't have that. Sample companies, I use Precision. They're really cheap. That's part of why I use them. They're cheap and good. They clean their panel a lot and they don't charge a maintenance, a panel fee. A lot of these will charge you a panel access fee of $500 to $1,000 just to open their freaking books to you. It is so dumb. Precision Sample just costs per person, and that's why I use them. Yeah, and I think, you know, with survey provider companies, just know that they often specialize in certain audiences. So I've given you a lot of general market ones, but if you want, for instance, BDMs and TDMs, there are some survey provider samples who specialize in dentists or tech or things like that. And you can find them through some really easy keystroke searches and then ask them for bids. And don't forget, don't be afraid to tell them their bids are full of shit. You know, if you're like, I am a startup on a startup budget, what, if anything, can you do for me? You know, don't be surprised if they can. Even come down, you know, I've had, you know, companies be like, I'm going to quote you at $7 per take on this. And I'll be like, can you do it for $5? That's really what my budget is. And they either will or they won't. So just kind of keep that open as well. Obviously don't, you know, treat anybody badly, but you know, if it's a question of a few dollars off of where you want to be per person, you might be able to get there.
And are any of these the companies? I actually wasn't familiar with the ones that you were referring to about mobile surveys where it was a couple questions and a video.
Yeah, a lot of different qualitative vendors will have that. So Schlesinger will have something like that. I think Focus Vision might have something like that. So like look for your big qualitative firms, and they're the ones that are going to have that kind of thing. The one I tend to use for mobile is Schlesinger. I think AHA might have something like that as well. You know, do some digging, but just like, you know, mobile ethnographies might be the Google search, or, you know, mobile snippet video research. You know, you're going to pull up some newbies as well. There is one based here in Washington State, and I'm totally blanking on the name. I'll dig it up and then I can come back to you. But yeah.
Do you ever talk to the folks at Discuss.io?
I have not.
Okay, they're one of the Seattle Angel Conference companies.
Oh, nice.
That
Awesome.
does
Yeah.
video qualitative stuff. The question I wanted to ask long ago was, you keep talking about SurveyMonkey as a survey company, but they also have the generate an audience for me.
Yep.
Do you think that's useful, or do they do a bad job of it enough that I should go to Precision Sample?
I don't use my survey companies to source my sample. I never have. You know, that may just be my bias. I may be completely wrong, but I just, you know, feel like the focus for those companies is their platform. And their side business is when people are sort of lazy and kind of go like, hey, can you just do this for me? I don't necessarily see that as their primary modality. And therefore, I want a company that has that as their primary modality, is that they're the ones who are sort of reaching out, constantly cleaning their panel. But ask them. I mean, I've been in touch with Sind. I haven't been in touch with Lightspeed or MarketCube recently, but like, how often do you reach out and clean your panel? How are you incenting people? That's on there too. A lot of companies will incent people based on frequency, and they will allow people to take as many surveys as they want in a month. And then they generate points and points and points, and then they can turn those points in for something. I don't like survey companies that incentivize off of points, because what they're basically doing, I love it when my people get cash. Because when you're getting points, you're gamifying. You're more likely to try to take a qualifying survey and lie to try to get into that survey by saying, oh yes, I'm female who's 25, because they want to get in so that they can game the system and get more benefits. So I tend to stay away from ones who reward people and honestly asking people, how often do you allow people to take a survey, right? Can they just sit there and log in all day, every day and take surveys or not? That is important questioning to ask. So all of those things, of course, they can fib back to you. Of course, you may not ever know, but I think it's very nice to sort of ask those questions. How often are you reaching out to your people to verify their information? How do you incentivize? And, and just sort of making sure that they're sort of not allowing professional survey takers to just take 1,000 surveys. And my guess is with SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, if I'm running 64,000 studies for someone at the same time, am I going to pay as close of attention to that particular sample as I might be as a sample company who just has this whole database that is their whole mission and their whole job? SurveyMonkey will also write your surveys for you. Qualtrics will also write your surveys for you. They have consultancy services that will say, oh, we'll write you a survey if you need XYZ. I don't suggest doing it though. Yeah. But then again, I'm a researcher and I get paid for designing them.